Boldwood presents A Winter Baby for Gin Barrel Lane, written by Lindsey Hutchinson and read by Charlie Sanderson. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1.
You call the coppers and this little lady is dead, the man said as he held a knife to Dolly Perkins's throat. He had grabbed her as she'd limped into the bar of Daydream Palace to light the gas lamps. The young woman had dropped her walking cane and was now trying to balance her weight on her good leg. "Steady now. Don't do anything rash," Billy Bickley said. He was a doorman at the palace, along with his brother Bobby. But because he was big and lumbering, he had not been quick enough, and Dolly had been taken hostage. Billy edged forward as he tried to placate the knifeman. "Just tell us what you want." The gin palace was packed to the gunnels with revellers, but silence had descended and folk moved away from the scene unfolding before them. The owner of their favourite drinking den was at risk of death, and everyone held their breath as Billy inched his way through the crowd. "What I want," the man said, "is some gin for my old mother." "Well, that can be arranged," Billy said in a calm voice. Dolly felt the cold steel on her skin, and she clenched her buttocks and prayed her bladder would not give way and embarrass her in front of her customers. She dared not move for fear of being cut and bleeding to death on the sawdust-scattered floor. "Oh, I ain't got any money." The man's eyes flicked from Billy to the knife and back again. "That don't matter, mate. You let the boss go and she'll give you a quart for your mum." "If I let her go, you'll jump me." Dolly could smell the stale sweat emanating from her assailant's body. He was standing behind her, his one arm around her, the other hand holding the weapon at her neck. She could feel him trembling, and she was terrified the shaking might increase and cause the knife to prick her skin. "Nobody is going to jump you, pal. Just let the lady go. Come and get your gin and go home to your old mum." Bobby Bickley was threading his way around the room very slowly, trying to go unnoticed, but the man saw him. "You stop right there. Stop or I'll gut you, boss lady." Bobby halted, holding up his hands in surrender. Dolly closed her eyes tight for a second as the man dragged her back a step. "My leg," she said quietly. The man nodded to a woman so drunk she could barely stand. "Pick up that cane and give it to her." The woman bent over and grasped the cane, and as she straightened up she began to sway. "Hand it over," the man demanded. "All right, hold your horses," the woman slurred. Taking a step forward, she lifted the cane as if to pass it to Dolly, and the man's eyes moved to Billy, who simultaneously took a step. That was the man's mistake. In an instant, the woman hefted the stick and swung it in an arc, catching the man sharply on the elbow. The sudden pain of the blow forced his arm down and away from Dolly's neck, the knife falling from his fingers to clatter on the floor. He let out a howl and instinctively brought his other arm round to cradle the injury. In that same moment, Dolly lunged forward, dragging her crippled leg behind her. In her peripheral vision, she saw Billy and Bobby dash to the man and retrieve the knife. The man's assailant gave Dolly her cane and helped her back to her place behind the bar. Dragging the man along, Billy called out, "What shall we do with him?" Shouts and catcalls sounded as the crowd told Billy exactly what he could do with the man. "Bring him to the kitchen," Dolly said, then to Juliet, the barmaid, "and please fill that lady's glass on the house." "Oh, ta," the woman said with a grin that showed her blackened teeth. "Thank you for your help," Dolly said before going through to the back room, her hands still shaking. The Bickley brothers pulled the knifeman through to the kitchen, where they unceremoniously dumped him onto a chair. "Now then," Dolly began, trying to bring her emotions under control. "What the hell was all that about?" I told you, I just wanted some gin for my old mother. She's on her deathbed and it was all she wanted. You could have come and asked me for it, rather than... Dolly rubbed a hand across her neck where the sharp steel had rested. Oh, yes, and I suppose you would have given it free of charge, eh? The man asked sarcastically. Actually, if you had explained properly, then I would have. Dolly watched the man's eyes widen in disbelief, and she nodded. Look, I was never going to hurt you, honest. I just wanted... some gin, Dolly finished for him. Tell me about yourself, Mr... Whitehouse. Danny Whitehouse. Well, Danny, where do you live? Over in Lawrence Street. And what do you do for work? Danny gave a tight laugh. I ain't working. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's no jobs going out there. Billy smacked him across the back of the head, saying, Have some respect for the lady. Danny rubbed his head and glanced up at the big man. So I take it you are living with and taking care of your mother? Dolly asked. Yes. Is she very ill? Yes. She's 75 and is bedridden. She's eaten nothing for 2 days. Do you have food for her? Yes, but she won't eat. She's ready to die, but just wanted a sip of Mother's ruin before she goes. I'm sorry to hear it. Danny was again surprised at being treated so kindly after what he'd done. Bobby, would you please fetch me a quart of the best gin? White satin, I think, will do nicely. The fellow nodded and lumbered away. You going to hand me over to the bobbies? No. What then? I'm going to give you some gin to take to your mother. Then I'm going to offer you a job. You what? Danny could hardly believe his ears. It appears I need more security in the bar, so if you're interested... Yes, yes, please, miss. He corrected himself with a glance at Billy. Good. You can start whenever you wish. Ah, here's your gin. Thanks, Bobby. Dolly took the bottle and passed it to Danny. Boys, Danny will be starting work with you, so I'd be pleased if you would show him the ropes. I know what ropes I'd like to show him, Billy grumbled. Thanks, miss. Dolly's the name. I hope that drop helps your mum. Me too, Danny replied before leaving sharpish via the back door. You're too soft, Billy said. I know. You bugger off and you won't see hide nor hair of him again, Billy said. You could have died out there, Bobby intervened. Dolly nodded. I can't deny I was scared out of my wits. Then you go and give him a job, the man who tried to hurt you, Bobby said indignantly. I know he wanted to frighten me, which he did, but I don't imagine for a minute he would have killed me. You had a lucky escape. One slip and you'd be in the morgue by now, Billy said. His mum is dying, boys, so we have to show a little compassion. Now, back to work before that lot tear the place apart. Oh, and thank you both. The two brothers shuffled back to the bar, and Dolly finally sighed with relief. Were the Bickley brothers correct? Had she been too quick to offer her attacker a job? Something inside told her she had made the right choice, however. She had looked into Danny's eyes, and it was there she had seen utter desperation. She had been frightened for her life, but in the safety of the kitchen moments later, Dolly's heart went out to the man who was trying to fulfill his mother's dying wish. Would she have done the same for her own mother? Probably. Yes, but certainly not in the same way. Holding out her hands, she saw they were still shaking. Rubbing them together, she stood, picking up her trusty cane before she too went to the bar. Despite the large plate glass windows, the gas chandelier and wall lamps were lit in order to bounce the light off the huge mirrors behind the counter. Small casks stood in front of these mirrors, depicting the names of the different gins on offer. This was a ruse, as all the alcohol was the same. It was only how much it was watered down that differed. The floor was covered with fresh sawdust to soak up the spills, not that there were many. Gin was too precious to lose even one drop. The long counter was highly polished, beneath which sat the bottles within easy reach. As she glanced around the room, she smiled at the chair which greeted her, and she hoped she'd done the right thing where Danny Whitehouse was concerned. She had been lucky these past years running the Gin Palace, but this incident had been a warning. There were bad people out there, and now was the time to ensure she had some protectors in place. Knowing her friend Nellie Larkin would advise her, Dolly determined to seek that advice the following day. It was then that Aggie walked in. Well known by everyone in the town, Aggie was always dressed in tattered clothes, her grey hair piled untidily on her head. Her pink gums had long since lost their teeth, but this did not impede her speech. She was quick-witted and outspoken to the point of rudeness at times. And she was the town gossip. Nothing happened in this part of Birmingham without Aggie knowing about it first. The information she gathered was then exchanged for a free tot in the gin houses, so she rarely paid for a drink. The place erupted as the old woman lifted her skirts and began to dance. Aggie laughed loudly as she bent over, showing her bare bottom to everyone. Dolly sighed. Roll on tomorrow. Chapter 2. Dolly Perkins threw open the doors of Daydream Palace early to allow the fresh air to flush away the stink of unwashed bodies and the stale air of the previous night's drinking. She stood outside on the street with a cup of tea in hand and soaked up the rays of sunshine. Nodding to people passing by, Dolly pondered her life. At 13 years old, she had taken refuge in the yard of the Crown Saloon across the road from where she stood now. Found by Jack Larkin, she had been taken in by his mother, Nellie, who owned the Crown. She had run away from home after the death of her mother. Her stepfather wanted her to fill her mother's shoes in more ways than one. He had later been found dead by the railway line, suspected of being hit by a steam train whilst drunk. Nellie Larkin and Dolly had worked together to buy an old public house and transform it into the glittering gin palace she now co-owned. Already her mortgage to the bank was almost paid off since the business had done remarkably well. During the last 7 years, Jack, who was now 18 and still her best friend, had come to see her every day, despite living at the Crown Saloon. It had been thought for a long time that the two might marry, but Dolly saw Jack as a friend, not a husband. Grabbing her walking cane, which she'd leaned against the wall, Dolly limped back inside to help with the cleaning. Born with a withered leg, Dolly had never allowed it to hold her back, and consequently, she achieved everything she set out to do. Inside, Juliet Jenkins was already well into sweeping up the sawdust so it could be replaced by a fresh supply. Dolly smiled her thanks and took her cup back to the kitchen. Before long, she heard the voice of Janice, Juliet's sister. Janice had married Matt Dempster, who worked the bar for Nellie, and they had twin boys who were now 3 years old and quite a handful. Pouring tea, Dolly took it into the bar for Janice. "You're looking flustered this morning. Here, sit down and drink this." "Thanks, Dolly. The twins had me run ragged. As fast as I dressed Ben, Ethan was stripping his clothes off. It was all I could do to get them to the childminder and get here on time." "Couldn't Matt help?" Juliet asked. Janice laughed. "You must be joking. He just encourages them. They can do no wrong where he's concerned. I do love them all, but my God, they frustrate me." Dolly grinned, but deep inside she was envious. She was 21 now and had never had a sweetheart. She longed to be wed and have kiddies of her own. But the Gin Palace took up all of her time. Besides, she felt her gammy leg would put young men off wanting to court her. No man in his right mind would want a cripple for a wife, no matter how much she was worth. Dolly had long since resigned herself to the fact she would never be married or have a family, but sometimes the thought saddened her. Just then, a man stumbled in through the open doorway. "We're not open yet, Stanley. Give us an hour and come back then," Juliet said. "Bloody hell, what am I to do for an hour while I wait for you to finish cleaning up?" "Go home and sleep it off," Janice answered, aware he was still drunk from the night before. "Bugger it. I'm going to the Crown. Nellie will serve me." With that, Stanley staggered away, doing the tipple two-step. given the nickname by the serving staff, the walk of 2 steps forward and 1 back looked like it ought to be a dance. "I'm going over to see Nellie too, but I won't be long," Dolly said. "We'll stock the bar and have the place all clean and tidy for when you get back," Juliet said. Stepping out into the sunshine again, Dolly counted her blessings as she watched horse-drawn carts roll by. Birmingham in 1864 was an industrial town, its dirty streets spreading out like a spider's web. It boasted a railway station, a huge market with over 600 stalls, a town council, Bingley Exhibition Hall, a lunatic asylum at Winson Green, a prison, and a public bathhouse. It also boasted the imposing St. Chad's, which was named a cathedral by Pope Pius IX. It had a park, a workhouse, and the Birmingham Mint was the first metalworking company to be contracted to produce coins of £1 sterling. It was a very busy place, with people milling about it all times of the day and night, most of whom were out of work. The level of poverty was incredibly high, and families were living on the heath under tarpaulins. They were starving, and only when they could bear it no longer would they accept a ticket into the workhouse, knowing they would never be able to sign themselves out. A sad life with an even sadder ending. Dolly knew that could have been her fate and thanked her lucky stars that she had escaped the worst Birmingham had to offer. She heard the noise before she walked in through the back door. Nellie Larkin and her long-time friend Nancy were exchanging unpleasantries at full volume, as was their wont. "Where's our Jack?" Nellie called out. "He's in the cellar with Fred. They're taking out the empty caskets like you told them to," Nancy answered. "That was an hour ago. If that little sod is—" "No, Jack's 18 now. He ain't a kid anymore." "Oh, hello, Dolly," Nancy said as she saw the young woman enter the kitchen. "Are you two at it again?" Dolly asked with a wide grin. "Always and forever. Now Dolly's here." Nellie Larkin trundled through from the bar, her grey hair piled untidily on her head. "Hello, gal." "I've come for some advice, Nellie, if you have time." "Always got time for you, sweetheart. Nance, tea and biscuits, if you please." Nancy set the kettle to boil, grumbling under her breath. "Been here all these years and still treated like a skivvy." Nellie and Dolly exchanged an amused smile as they sat at the table. "How can we help?" "Oh, it's we now, is it?" Nancy said quietly. "It's always been us, Nance, even before you married Fred," Nellie replied soothingly. "Let me explain," Dolly interrupted before a full-blown argument broke out. She told them all about the incident in her bar the previous night and how she dealt with it. "You should have let the Bickley boys leather him," Nancy said scornfully. "Oh, ignore her. I think you did the right thing. But you watch this Danny Whitehouse. Make sure he's honest and loyal." "I will. But I came to ask the best way to employ some more muscle. Billy and Bobby are good men, but they're better working the cellar, really. And they don't seem to be cutting the mustard on the door anymore. It's difficult not having a full-time cellar man, so I thought to move them into that position, with a little sweetener, of course." Dolly rubbed her thumb and fingertips together as she spoke, denoting a raise in wages for the boys. "Then you won't have anybody in the bar or standing by the door," Nancy said as she covered the brown teapot with a knitted cosy. "Exactly. So alongside Danny, I need to know where to hire some other men for those jobs." "What about the bread line?" Nellie suggested. "I wondered about that too," Dolly concurred. "Take Fred with you, lovey. He knows everybody, and no one will mess with you if he's there," Nancy said. "Thanks. That's a great idea." A moment later, the man in question came up from the cellar, followed by Jack, and Nellie outlined what Dolly needed. While Nellie talked, Dolly looked at Jack, and she could barely believe how much he'd grown since the day they'd first met. He was a handsome young man now. His dark hair was always clean and shiny, and his brown eyes held a constant twinkle. The timbre of his voice was deep and pleasant, smooth like cream on coffee. Her mind slipped back through the years to how she and Jack had worked Nellie's bar together, along with Poppy, who was now wed to Noah Dempster, Nellie's doorman. They had been one big happy family back then, and to a degree they still were. It was a little different now, with Dolly living and working across the road, but they always had each other's backs in times of need. "I could move over and work for Dolly," Jack said, snapping Dolly back to the conversation. "No, lad, you need it here," Nellie said, clearly unwilling to let her son go. Once more, Dolly's thoughts travelled back to when, at 10 years old, Jack had discovered he'd been left on Nellie's doorstep as a baby. Always believing he was Nellie's boy, it had come as a major shock to discover he was a foundling. But after talking it through with Dolly, he had come to accept it in time. Pulling herself back to the present, Dolly listened as Fred, who had always looked out for her, agreed to accompany her to seek out workers from the ever-growing bread line. "We'll go after dinner if that's all right, 'cause I can't miss my Nancy's food," the big man said, rubbing his hands together. "I don't blame you for that," Dolly said. "I'll see you about 2:00 then." Dolly left them to their work and sauntered back to Daydream Palace. Walking through the back door, she was surprised to see Danny Whitehouse sitting at the table, waiting for her. Chapter 3. "I didn't expect to see you for a while yet," Dolly said, and nodded to Billy, who stood towering over Danny. "My mother passed away last night," the young man said sadly. "I'm very sorry for your loss," Dolly responded quietly. "Thank you. She enjoyed a drop of gin, though." Danny gave a wan smile before his sadness returned. "I'm glad for that." "I was wondering, would it be possible—" "Do you want to start work sooner? I'm guessing you have no money for the funeral." Dolly's hunch was proved right when Danny nodded. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd work off what I owe for the gin so my debt to you is paid. You've been kindness itself to me, and I know I don't deserve it." "What about laying your mum to rest?" Dolly asked. "It will have to be a pauper's grave," Danny said, a look of abject misery crossing his face. Reaching into her apron pocket, Dolly drew out her purse. Passing enough for a burial over to the forlorn Danny, she said, "Go and bury your mum. Come back when it's all done and you can start then." "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his fair hair falling over his blue eyes as he bowed his head. "You can thank me by being honest and loyal like Billy here." Dolly tilted her head towards the big man, who puffed out his chest with pride. "I will, my oath on it." "Then that's good enough for me. Oh, and Danny, before you go, who does your house belong to?" Danny frowned at the question. "It was my mum's. Why?" "I was concerned that it may be rented and that you were at risk of being turned out," Dolly answered. "Oh, I see. No, I'm all right, but I thank you for the consideration. I'll see you next week if the vicar can fit Mum in before then. Thank you again." With that, Danny left. "I hope you're right about him," Billy muttered. "So do I, but for now I need to speak with you and Bobby." Billy found his brother in the cellar, and they stood in the kitchen awaiting their fate. Were they to be yelled at for not protecting their boss sufficiently and allowing her to be put in danger? Was Dolly about to sack them? "I need to know if you two would take on the cellar work full time." "Is this because of last night?" Bobby asked. "Well, yes, the idea stems from that, but honestly, I need your strength with the barrels and kegs." "What about the bar?" Billy asked. "I've decided it's time for reinforcements, so I'm going to the bread line this afternoon, and Fred Dell is coming with me. So what do you reckon? I'd need your answers before I go." "I prefer the cellar," Billy said. "Me and all," his brother concurred. "Good. In that case, I'm upping your wages by $1 a week." "2 bob, thanks, Dolly," Billy gushed. 2 shillings will help a lot," Bobby added. "Right, away with you," Dolly said with a grin. She knew the Bickley family was a large one, and the boys took a little money from their wages back to their parents to help out. They shared a room at the Daydream Palace in order to be on the premises at night and also relieve the overcrowding at home. Dolly sat at the table and pondered. She needed doormen and bodyguards, but she also needed more bar staff. Now that Janice had twin boys to take care of, Dolly knew there would be times when they would need their mum at home. Jack had helped out at the busiest times over the years, but she could not rely on him coming to her aid. He worked for Nellie, and he was needed there. So it made sense to employ more staff. Having checked her books with the solicitor, Mr. Sharp, regularly, she knew she could afford it. A very wise older man, Mr. Sharp had been hers and Nellie's solicitor for years and had helped them buy and renovate the palace. She always thought of and addressed him as formally as his greater years demanded. She wondered whether the men on the breadline would be interested in the bar staff positions also. How many would she need to employ, all told? Dolly thought she would ask Fred when he arrived later. Going through to the bar, she was pleased to see it was packed, even at this time in the morning. Folk always found the money for their gin, regardless of how badly off they were. Her business was foolproof. "Here she is," a man yelled from the crowd. "Our Dolly." She waved and gave him a grin. "Thank God you're here, we're flat out," Juliet gasped. "Go and get a cup of tea, I'll take over," Dolly said. "We have to get a living cook, Dolly. It's too much for the two of us," the girl responded. "I've been thinking the same," Dolly said as she served an eager customer. "I'll call in at the servants' registry later." Juliet nodded and went to take the weight off her feet for 10 minutes. The noise in the bar was loud as people talked, argued and sang. The drink was flowing copiously and folk were happy, at least for the time being. The doors were propped open to allow the warm summer wind to circulate, and men and women stood 6 thick waiting to be served. "Dolly, oh Dolly, I love you," an old man said in a sing-song voice. "I'm glad to hear it," Dolly sang back. All morning they were rushed off their feet, tots of cream of the valley, royal poverty and blue ruin flying across the counter. Coins rattled into the till constantly, a metal symphony accompanying the call for more gin. At lunchtime, Dolly grabbed some bread and cheese and a cup of tea in the kitchen before starting back again behind the bar. She saw Fred come in and was surprised at how quickly the time had sped past. Promising to be as quick as possible, Dolly grabbed a parasol from the umbrella stand in the scullery and left via the back door with Fred at her side. The relentless sun was only broken momentarily by a breeze like a soft, gentle kiss. Fred wore his shirt sleeves rolled up above the elbow, his braces holding up his trousers and a flat cap to shield his head from the sun's rays. His big boots thudded on the cobbles as they strode down the street. "How many men will I need, do you think? I've decided it's time to stop cutting corners," Dolly asked. After a moment's thought, Fred answered, "Well, ideally about 10, I would guess. 2 on the door, 4 behind the bar to give you ladies a rest, and 4 walking the floor." Dolly nodded. She knew he was speaking sense, and the business could afford it. Eventually they came to the corner of James Watt Street and saw a crowd of men chatting. 1 or 2 were standing on one leg, the other foot and their backs resting on the wall of a pub, their hands in their pockets. Some were smoking pipes. Others had hand-rolled cigarettes. All across the town, many street corners had developed bread lines. Groups of men waiting in the hope that some wealthy businessman would come along and offer them work. These men would stand all day, come rain or shine, for the promise of a job. It was thought the term breadline stemmed from the men standing in a neat line waiting to be offered toil enough to earn a crust. In reality, the line spent their time putting the world to rights while they awaited the employers who knew where these breadlines were, should they need workers. As they neared, Fred said, "Cover your ears." Dolly looked up at him and hunched her shoulders, holding out her parasol in one hand and her cane in the other. "Oh, right, I'll make it quick then," Fred said awkwardly. He shoved his forefinger and thumb in his mouth and sent out a loud, shrill whistle. The talking stopped immediately, and the men gathered around. "Most of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Fred Dell, and I work at the Crown Saloon. This lady is Miss Dolly Perkins, and she's the owner of the Daydream Palace, and she's looking for workers."
"Good afternoon, gentlemen."
A few grunts greeted her, and Dolly looked up at Fred, who nodded for her to continue.
"I'm looking for workers, as Fred said. I need to know how many of you are married."
She watched as all but one hand went up.
"And how many of you have children?"
All but two raised this time. Turning to Fred, she whispered,
"How do I choose?"
Fred shrugged.
"I'm thinking to hire 10 men,
Dolly went on, and was taken aback by the response.
"Me, miss,"
one man called.
"We'll tackle anything that pays a wage,"
said another.
"I think it fair to hire those with families to feed,"
Dolly said.
"I need men to work the door at the Daydream, as well as some to throw the troublemakers out."
"That's you out then, Bert, because you're a troublemaker yourself," a man at the back said, causing laughter to ripple amongst the gathering.
"Fred, what about if I took them all on? That way I could have a day shift and a night shift. It would mean they could all be earning too."
"Can you afford that many, though?" Fred asked.
"Yes, I think so. We were guessing 10, but there's 12 here, so we'll just have to sell more gin."
"It's up to you, Dolly."
"I can employ all of you if you've a mind to take the work," she called out.
"Yes, miss."
"Thank you, miss."
Dolly smiled.
"Right, come along to the Daydream Palace tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Doors open at 9, so be on time. I expect honesty, loyalty, and good work in exchange for a fair wage. Anyone shirking their duties will be out on their ear because I don't suffer fools gladly." "Thank you, gentlemen. I'll see you in the morning. Oh, and tell your wives you'll have breakfast with us."
Flat caps flew into the air, and yips and laughter sounded. Shouting their thanks, the men dispersed, and Dolly and Fred turned for home.
"I'll have to work out a rota now, I suppose,"
Dolly said with a grin. "You've made a lot of men happy today, Dolly. Their families will be able to eat now, too." Dolly thought about that as she limped her way back towards the Daydream Palace.
"I have to go to the servants' registry. I'm going to get us a good cook and a maid."
"A couple more people to be grateful to you."
"I'll be the one being grateful, Fred. I need the help with the cooking and cleaning. We've had a few years of real hard work, and now we can afford it. We might as well have someone to take over the domestic chores. I just hope I can find somebody as good as Nancy."
"There ain't nobody like my Nancy," Fred said with a beaming smile.
"Well, let's go and see what's on offer,"
Dolly answered, matching his grin.
Chapter 4. "Good morning. I'm looking for a cook and a maid, both to live in," Dolly said to the woman behind the desk in the servants' registry office.
The office was situated in Hill Street, which flanked New Street Railway Station. The brickwork was covered in grime carried by the steam from the engines. Inside was a dingy room, the small windows letting in little light, and the gas lamps guttered, giving out tiny flashes before settling to burn evenly again for another short while. There were no chairs other than the one the woman occupied, so those seeking either work or workers were forced to stand. A notice was pinned to the wall stating the fees: 6pence for registry and 3pence for an enquiry. Clearly this office took a fee from both employer and servant. Those looking for a job would pay their fee giving their name, address, what type of work they were looking for, and their skill sets. All this was entered into a large book. Looking up from her ledger, the woman peered over her spectacles, which were perched on the end of her nose. Her gaze moved from Dolly to the towering figure of Fred.
"I'll need details. Your name?"
"Dolly Perkins."
"Address?"
"Daydream Palace, Gin Barrel Lane." The woman leaned back in her chair and eyed Dolly.
"I'm not sure I have anyone on my books who would wish to work in a place like that."
"Have you looked?"
"No, but..."
"Then I suggest you do. That's what your job is, isn't it? Besides, how would you feel knowing you had done someone out of work because of your prejudices?" The woman harumphed and flicked through her thick ledger. Running a finger down the column of neatly written names, she stopped at one. Grabbing a scrap of paper, she wrote down the name, then continued down the column before finding another, which she added to the first. Taking the paper, Dolly paid the fee. "When can I expect them?" The woman shrugged her shoulders. "That's anyone's guess. Tomorrow maybe, if I can get a message to them." Leaning forward, Dolly said quietly but forcefully, "Not good enough. I'll see them later today, or I'll have Fred here collect that fee you've just taken." "Very well, I'll see what I can do," the woman muttered, her eyes flicking to Fred and back to Dolly. "Thank you," Dolly said, before she and her companion left the office. "Well done, lass," Fred said, laughing as they meandered back home. "Bloody woman," Dolly said. "You sound just like Nellie," Fred said jokingly. "She taught me well, as did Nancy," Dolly replied. Fred beamed his pleasure at having his wife complimented. "Thanks for your help today, Fred." The big man nodded, delighted to feel so important. They parted company at the end of Aston Street, each going to their respective homes. Entering through the back door, Dolly heard singing, which told her that her customers were happy. Going through to the bar, she saw old Aggie sidle forward. "Did you know? Old Mrs. Whitehouse has passed on. Some say she choked on her gin," Aggie cackled, as she placed her empty glass on the bar. "I'd already heard," Dolly replied as she pushed the glass back and served another customer, a woman with a sleeping child tied to her chest with a massive woolen shawl. Aggie frowned, deepening the lines on her face. She was the font of all knowledge in the area, and she swapped snippets of information for a free drink. She'd been doing it for years, both here and at the Crown, and on occasions had proved herself extremely useful. "Ah, but did you know Jack Larkin has got himself a sweetheart?" Aggie's eyes narrowed as she studied the shock registering on Dolly's face. "I don't believe that for a minute, you old bugger," Dolly retorted. "Here, have a drink on the house for thinking up a lie in double quick time." "What makes you think it's a lie?" "Because Nellie works that lad half to death. When would he have time to find and court a girl?" Aggie gave a curt nod and smiled a toothless grin. Dolly passed over the filled glass and carried on with her work. In the back of her mind, the lie lingered, pushing its way forward every now and then, giving Dolly an uncomfortable feeling which she couldn't explain or shake off. Jack was perfectly entitled to find himself a lady friend, so why did the thought bother her so much? She had known the day would come when he would fall in love and wish to marry, but somehow Aggie's words felt like a slap in the face. If Jack was courting, would he tell her? They were close after all, but something like stepping out with a girl was a private thing, so maybe he would keep it to himself. Was that what irked her? The fact that she finally realised Jack had a life of his own, that they weren't kids anymore and didn't tell each other everything as they once did. Endeavouring to shake off the discomfort, Dolly continued to serve one person after another. It was around 6 o'clock when an older woman pushed her way through the crowd. "I need to speak with Dolly Perkins," she called out. "That's me. The servants' registry sent me." "Come on through," Dolly shouted, lifting the end of the counter and pushing the little gate open. The woman followed Dolly into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She glanced around at the shiny pots and pans hanging on hooks on the walls. Then her eyes moved to Dolly, who was preparing a pot of tea. "I've come about the job." "Which one?" "Cook. Why? Is there another?" "I'm looking for a maid too." "Oh, well, I ain't doing that." Dolly grinned, her back to the woman. "So tell me your name and a bit about yourself while we have tea." Sitting down opposite the woman, Dolly poured the tea and watched her visitor. Her clothes were old but clean. Her dark hair showed signs of grey, but her brown eyes gleamed with vitality. "I'm Sadie Kemp, and I'm renting a dossole of a room over in Freeman Street." "Isn't that near to the hide and skin market?" Ah, and it bloody stinks, let me tell you. Can't have the windows open because of it. The same windows that rattle in the frame every time the steam train thunders past.
I expect you know this is a living post.
I do, and I thank the Almighty for that small blessing. Just so as you know, I speak as a find.
I gathered, but I like that, Dolly answered, and as she spoke she wondered whether, if she hired Sadie, they would have the same relationship as Nellie and Nancy. Would they become firm friends who constantly bickered? That wouldn't be such a bad thing. Tell me what you like to cook and what experience do you have?
I worked for Lady Fortington Smythe at one time, but I left.
Oh, why is that?
The wealthy are just that because they don't pay much in the way of wages. When I asked for a rise, the mistress said the only rise I was getting was to my feet to carry me out and on my way. I told her to stick a job up her arse.
Dolly stifled a grin, already beginning to like this woman.
As for cooking, I like faggots. I make my own. Kidney pudding, grey pies and gluty pudding. Lots of beef and groats in that, good and nourishing. Bread and butter pudding with plenty of currants, suet roly-poly.
That all sounds delicious, Dolly cut in, afraid Sadie would go on and on. The pay for a cook is around £17 a year, I believe, but I'm paying 20. How does that sound?
Bloody marvellous.
Fine in that case. When can you start?
How does now sound to you?
Won't you need to collect your things?
I have them here.
Sadie nodded to an old shopping bag Dolly had not noticed before. Well, that's organised. Fine then, come with me and I'll show you to your room. Welcome on board, Sadie. Dolly led her new cook up the back stairs and was pleased to see Sadie's face light up.
Oh, this is lovely, Sadie said as she dropped her bag on the bed and walked to the window. Look at all those rooftops. Makes you feel like you're on top of the world.
I'll leave you to settle in. Dragging off her coat, Sadie hung it in the wardrobe.
I'm in and ready to start work.
Dolly smiled. Come on then, and get acquainted firstly with your kitchen and then with the other staff. Downstairs, Sadie rooted around in the pantry and cupboards whilst Dolly went to the bar. Introductions would have to wait. The place was packed with folks screaming for their tots of gin. It was not long before a young woman appeared, saying she was a maid sent by the registry. Dolly again ushered her to the kitchen for an interview, and noticed with pleasure that Sadie was already working hard on an evening meal. My name is Alice Cliff, the girl said quietly. Questions were asked and answered, tea was served, and Alice showed herself to be clumsy, having upset the milk jug. Trying to clean up the mess with a handkerchief hastily snatched from her pocket, she pushed back her blonde hair with sticky fingers. Sadie scowled as she took over and refreshed the jug. Alice was flustered and muttered, I'm so sorry. Don't worry about that. Accidents happen. As Alice's story was slowly revealed, their impatience was soon forgotten, as both Dolly and Sadie began to feel terribly sorry in their hearts for the girl who sat at the table. Chapter 5. My mum had problems giving birth to me, and after that she couldn't have any more children. She died last year, something to do with the kidneys, the doctor said. Sadie had sat down to listen to the girl's tale and poured herself some tea. Anyway, it was just me and Dad then, but he wasn't the same after Mum went and he took to the drink. He got the sack from the pit and we got turned out of our home by the pit boss. Where have you been living? Sadie asked gently. And where's your dad now? Dolly added with a worried glance at the cook. He went to the heath, to the tarpaulin families, and camped out there. Sadie drew in a breath. You poor lass. And I thought I'd had it bad. Dad got drunk one night, though heaven knows how, 'cause he had no money, and he threw himself in front of the steam train. Dear God, Sadie exclaimed. I'm sorry. I heard about that accident. So it was your father? The girl nodded. I know some maids earn about £6 a year, but I'll do it for £5 if you'll have me, Alice begged. Of course we'll have you, Dolly said, then, seeing Alice's face light up, went on. But not for £5. I'll pay you £10 a year to make sure you do a good job. Oh, thanks, Miss Dolly. Sadie, could you show Alice upstairs, please? Her room will be next to yours. Seeing the cook nod, she spoke again to Alice. Unless there's anything you need to do first. Like what? Maybe gather your belongings and bring them here? I don't have anything but what I stand up in. No spare clothes? Alice shook her head. No, nothing. Thanks, Dolly. I won't let you down. Watching them go, Dolly shook her own head at the girl's misfortune. Hopefully, in time, Alice would look upon them all as her second family. In the meantime, Dolly would sort out some of her own clothes and hope Alice didn't think it was charity. A shout from the bar had Dolly on her feet with a sigh. Clearly, the next busy wave had begun, with the employed leaving work to grace her premises with their presence. Day became night, which was just as busy in the bar, and it was gone midnight before Dolly saw her bed. The following morning saw 12 men arrive on the doorstep of the palace exactly on time. Dolly led them into the bar and explained what she needed. Each one gratefully accepted the task allotted to them, and those who were on the daytime rota were happy to begin work immediately. Sadie and Alice had been up for quite a while to cook breakfast for everyone, and as the kitchen was too small to accommodate them all, they ate in the bar. Once their hunger was sated, Dolly said, "Respect is the watchword in this place." She nodded her thanks as pots of tea were brought out. "We all respect each other as well as look out for our ladies here. I have extra bar staff to help out, so everyone will be able to take regular breaks for a rest and to eat." Dolly indicated the female staff with a wave of her hand. "You work hard for me, and I'll ensure you are rewarded." "We heard what you did for Danny Whitehouse, and you have our thanks for that too," one man said. Dolly inclined her head in acknowledgement. "We need to draw in custom, as it's my intention to endeavour to open another gin palace should the right property become available." "Won't we lose trade here if you do that?" Janice asked. "Not if the new place is across the other side of the town," Dolly replied. "So if any of you hear of a pub for sale, let me know, and I may be able to negotiate a good price." A quiet buzz of voices echoed in the room before a man spoke up. "I heard the pub on Horse Fair by the drill hall he's looking to sell." But I believe Ezra Morton would be interested in it and all," called another. "Well then, that might be worth a look," Dolly said. "Right, lads, to work, please." Dolly retired to the kitchen to think on what had been said, and her mind took her back to her dealings with Mr. Morton many years ago now. Nellie Larkin had been indebted to Morton for a loan she'd had to refurbish the Crown's saloon. Dolly had sold the expensive necklace left to her by her mother and had given Nellie enough money to pay off that loan. Morton, furious at losing the interest on the repayments, and also because it meant Nellie was no longer tied to only selling his gin, had tried to prevent Nellie from receiving alcohol from elsewhere by threatening all the suppliers in the town. But Morton had underestimated the women, and Nellie had thwarted him again by finding a distiller further afield who continued to deliver both to Nellie and Dolly. Although he had left them in peace ever since, Dolly knew the man would not have forgotten their dealings. Now it looked very much like Dolly and Morton might cross paths again. Dolly gave an involuntary shiver as she recalled Morton's reputation as a gangster. His bully boy tactics